A respected judge hands down a 70-year sentence to a 12-year-old boy he believes is guilty. However, when a forgotten piece of evidence comes to light, it uncovers a web of corruption so extensive it rattles the justice system to its foundation. The courtroom was filled that day in San Marcos, Texas. The atmosphere was heavy, not just with the stifling summer heat, but with the weight of the decision about to be announced. All eyes were fixed on Judge Harold Cranston, a man whose reputation preceded him, known for his unwavering judgments and strict adherence to the law. Judge Cranston had become a symbol of authority and fairness in the small town. At 68, with nearly 4 decades on the bench, his face bore the lines of a man who had witnessed it all, every kind of crime, every plea for compassion. The defendant, 12-year-old Caleb Warner, stood at the defense table, his hands shaking, but his gaze unwavering. He was slender, with wide brown eyes that seemed to absorb every detail around him. Despite his youth, Caleb wore the expression of someone much older, as if the burden of the world had already pressed down on his small shoulders. He had proclaimed his innocence from the beginning, even as he was arrested for the armed robbery of a convenience store that left the clerk in critical condition. Yet today, his voice would not matter. "Master Warner," Judge Cranston began, his deep voice resonating in the room, "you stand convicted by a jury of your peers for actions that have left a lasting scar on this community. Your behavior, reckless and intentional, has caused significant harm." The boy's mother, seated in the back row, stifled a sob. She had implored the court to view Caleb as more than just a case number, to see the son she had nurtured, the child who adored science and aspired to become an astronaut. But the evidence had spoken louder. Eyewitness testimonies, grainy surveillance footage, and an anonymous tip that sealed Caleb's fate. "I hereby sentence you to 70 years in state custody," Cranston declared, his gavel striking the oak block. The sound resonated like a final heartbeat. Caleb remained motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if holding back tears or words that would never alter the outcome. The room erupted into whispers, gasps, and the frantic scribbling of reporters' pens. Caleb turned to look at his mother one last time before being led away. His shackled footsteps faded, leaving only silence behind. Judge Cranston returned to his chambers and poured himself a cup of black coffee, staring into its swirling surface. The day had been long, but justice, as he perceived it, had been served. Yet a faint unease lingered, a whisper of doubt that he quickly dismissed. His fatigue, unbeknownst to him, the truth he had just buried, would soon claw its way to the surface. The trial had been a spectacle dubbed the Warner case by local news outlets. The robbery of Parker's corner store had captured public attention, not only for its boldness, but for its aftermath. A masked assailant had stormed the store on a quiet Tuesday evening, brandishing a weapon and escaping with $5,000 in cash and merchandise. The chaos left the store clerk, Harold Peters, fighting for his life after being shot during the robbery. Caleb Warner, a 7th grader with no prior record, was arrested 2 weeks later following an anonymous tip. Prosecution painted a damning picture. Recovered from a storage locker under Caleb's name were items matching those stolen during the robbery. Surveillance footage showed a figure of similar build, and eyewitnesses claimed Caleb's voice resembled the suspect's. Most incriminating of all were the fingerprints on the weapon left behind, which matched Caleb's. His defense attorney, overworked and underpaid, struggled to counter the overwhelming evidence. Caleb insisted, "I didn't do this. I was home that night." But his alibi crumbled when his older brother, the only potential witness, admitted he hadn't seen Caleb for hours that evening. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict. Caleb didn't flinch as the foreperson read the decision, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed his inner turmoil. Judge Cranston, impartial as always, prepared to deliver what he believed was a fair sentence. He had seen offenders of all kinds, and to him, Caleb was no different. The evidence was clear, the punishment appropriate. Yet as Cranston signed the sentencing documents that evening, a nagging thought lingered. Something about the case felt unfinished. Weeks turned into months. Caleb languished in juvenile detention, awaiting transfer to a high-security facility. Meanwhile, Judge Cranston's life continued as usual. That was, until a nondescript file landed on his desk one quiet afternoon. It was part of an unrelated police misconduct investigation, but a single name caught his attention: Caleb Warner.
Cranston frowned and flipped through the pages.
The file detailed an evidence log from a separate case, including a weapon, a handgun, that matched the one used in the Parker's corner store robbery. The issue? This gun had been confiscated in an unrelated arrest days before Caleb's alleged crime.
Cranston leaned back in his chair, his pulse quickening.
If the weapon had already been in police custody, it couldn't have been used in the robbery. He cross-referenced the serial number with Caleb's trial documents. It was an exact match. A chilling realization washed over him. The evidence against Caleb was flawed, possibly tampered with. Cranston requested the full case file for the unrelated arrest. When it arrived, it painted a troubling picture. The arresting officer, Detective Alan Ruiz, had also been the lead investigator in Caleb's case. Determined to uncover the truth, Cranston contacted his old friend and retired investigator Thomas Greer over a late-night coffee meeting at a diner on the outskirts of town. Cranston laid out his findings. "This isn't negligence," Greer said, his voice low but firm. "This is a setup."
Together, they began to investigate. Within weeks, they uncovered falsified reports, altered witness statements, and a disturbing pattern of behavior from Detective Ruiz. One witness, a teenage cashier who had initially identified another suspect, admitted he had been coerced into changing his testimony. "Ruiz told me if I didn't cooperate, I'd be charged as an accomplice," the boy confessed. The final piece of the puzzle came when Greer managed to recover deleted emails from Ruiz's police account. One email sent to the district attorney outlined a plan to secure a conviction in Caleb's case, complete with fabricated evidence. Attached was a list of manipulated items, including the weapon and fingerprints. Cranston's hands trembled as he read the document. The system he had dedicated his life to was deeply flawed, yet there was no time for despair. He had the proof he needed to act. Cranston filed a motion to reopen Caleb's case, attaching the incriminating evidence against Ruiz.
The motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse. Some praised Cranston's bravery. Others questioned his motives. The backlash was swift and personal. Anonymous threats flooded his phone, his tires were slashed, and a note was left on his car. "Drop it or else." But Cranston was determined. The boy he had sentenced deserved justice.
Detective Ruiz denied the allegations, calling them a baseless attack on his career. But as the investigation deepened, the walls closed in. Surveillance footage from a parking lot near the store on the night of the robbery showed a man matching Ruiz's description, carrying a duffel bag. The implication was clear. Ruiz had orchestrated the robbery and framed Caleb to cover his tracks. Cranston called for an emergency hearing. The courtroom was packed as the footage played. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the truth became undeniable.
"This man," Cranston said, pointing to the screen, "manipulated evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent child. We failed Caleb Warner, and it's time to make it right."
Ruiz, sitting in the gallery, was arrested on the spot.
"You don't know what you've started," he hissed as he was led away.
Weeks later, Caleb's conviction was overturned. The courtroom erupted in applause as the boy was freed. His mother embraced him, tears streaming down her face. Cranston watched from the back, a rare smile softening his features. Justice had prevailed, but it had come at a cost. The fallout from the case was immense. Ruiz faced criminal charges, and a federal investigation into the San Marcos Police Department uncovered widespread corruption. Cranston's actions sparked nationwide calls for reform, and Caleb's story became a symbol of hope. Despite the accolades, Cranston remained reflective. He had seen the system's flaws firsthand and vowed to spend the rest of his career advocating for change. As for Caleb, his journey was just beginning. He dedicated himself to helping others who had been wrongfully convicted, becoming a symbol of resilience and the pursuit of truth. Their story served as a reminder that justice requires vigilance and courage, and that even in the darkest moments, the truth can prevail. As her confidence grew, the music swelled. Her hands moved with a grace that belied the chaos inside her, the notes pouring out like a confession. Each chord seemed to carry a piece of her story. The sacrifices her mother made, the nights she spent practicing in a cramped room, the weight of dreams deferred but never abandoned. The diners fell silent, their earlier chatter replaced by a collective stillness. Even Leonard, who had been whispering to his companions,
went quiet. Deborah didn't need to look at him to feel the shift in the room. The mocking energy had dissipated, replaced by something she couldn't quite name. Perhaps awe, perhaps humility. The music soared, and Deborah let herself go. For the first time in what felt like years, she wasn't a waitress or a struggling dreamer. She was simply herself, an artist. Her fingers danced across the keys, drawing out emotions so raw and vivid they seemed to hang in the air like smoke. By the time she struck the final chord, the room was utterly still. For a moment, there was no sound, just the lingering resonance of the piano. Deborah sat frozen, her hands still resting on the keys, unsure of what would come next. Then, as though released from a spell, the audience erupted into applause. The sound was thunderous, reverberating off the walls and filling the room with a warmth Deborah hadn't expected. Some diners stood, clapping with a fervor that brought tears to her eyes. Her co-workers, who had been watching from the sidelines, joined in, their faces lit with pride. Leonard, however, remained seated. His smirk was gone, replaced by an expression Deborah couldn't quite decipher. Part shock, part discomfort. He raised his hands and clapped slowly, a hollow sound compared to the cheers around him. But even his hesitant applause couldn't overshadow what Deborah had just done. She had reclaimed her voice, and no amount of condescension could take that away. As the applause began to fade, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Deborah slowly stood, her knees still trembling but her back straight. She glanced around, and for the first time that evening, she truly saw the people watching her, not as spectators, but as witnesses. Their expressions carried something new: admiration, respect, and even a hint of awe. She didn't look at Leonard right away. Instead, she gave a small polite nod to the diners who had clapped the loudest, her lips curving into a faint smile. It wasn't pride she felt, but relief. Relief that she hadn't let fear silence her. But then, as though magnetized, her gaze shifted to Leonard. He was still seated, his hands clasped in front of him on the table. The confident smirk he'd worn so brazenly earlier was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face was a mask of forced neutrality, as though he couldn't decide whether to admit his misstep or double down on his arrogance. "Well," Leonard finally said, his voice louder than it needed to be, breaking the fragile silence that had settled over the room. "That was unexpected." He chuckled lightly, though it lacked its usual bravado. "I suppose talent really does come from the most surprising places." The comment landed like a dull thud. His companions exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. Deborah tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words were meant to be an olive branch, but they were hollow, weighed down by his inability to truly own the moment. "Thank you," Deborah said, her tone steady and deliberate. There was no warmth in her voice, but no hostility either. She wasn't about to let him pull her back into the smallness he'd tried to impose. Her performance had spoken louder than any rebuttal she could offer. Leonard cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective gaze. He gestured toward the waiter for another drink, a flimsy attempt to regain his composure. "You've got quite a gift," he added, almost begrudgingly. Deborah nodded once, her gaze unwavering. "Everyone has a gift," she said, the weight of her words deliberate. "It's how you choose to use it that matters." The room seemed to hold its breath again, the subtle sting of her response rippling through the air. Away. It wasn't loud, it wasn't aggressive, but it was enough. Leonard shifted in his seat, his usual air of dominance slipping further with each passing second. The diners began to turn their attention back to their meals, though the energy in the room had shifted entirely. Where there had once been the quiet hum of privilege and pretense, there was now something richer, a shared understanding, perhaps even respect for the waitress, who had reminded everyone of the power of authenticity. But Leonard wasn't just humiliated. He was exposed, and no amount of charm could shield him from the truth. Everyone in the room now saw. Deborah stepped away from the piano, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. Her colleagues greeted her with quiet smiles and subtle nods of encouragement as she returned to her station. She still had a job to finish, but something about her posture had changed. Her head was held a little higher, her movements more deliberate.
Leonard's table had quieted. His entourage, who had laughed so freely at her expense earlier, now avoided eye contact, their conversation subdued. The bravado that once filled their corner of the restaurant had evaporated, leaving only an awkward silence in its place. The night continued, but Deborah felt lighter. Each step she took through the dining room felt more purposeful, her confidence blooming in a way she hadn't expected. As she refilled glasses and cleared plates, patrons stopped her to offer kind words. "You're incredible," one older woman said softly as Deborah set down a coffee cup. "I don't think I've ever heard anything so moving." "Keep going," another man added. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Deborah thanked them with quiet humility, her heart swelling with gratitude. These weren't just compliments. They were validations of everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of becoming. Leonard, however, was not so gracious. As Deborah approached his table to deliver the check, he looked up at her with an expression that teetered between annoyance and reluctant admiration. "You've made your point," he said, his tone clipped. "No need to rub it in." Deborah paused, meeting his gaze directly. "It was never about proving anything to you," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "I just wanted to play." Leonard had no response. He fidgeted with his drink, his once commanding presence reduced to an awkward shuffle. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone at the table knew it. As Leonard scribbled his signature on the check, one of his companions, a younger man with a softer demeanor, looked at Deborah and said, "You are amazing, truly." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and for a moment she saw a flicker of humanity in a group she had written off as shallow. "Thank you," she replied, offering a small smile before walking away. The night ended with Leonard and his group leaving quietly, their usual grand exit replaced by a hasty retreat. Deborah watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness. She wasn't thinking about Leonard anymore. Her mind was already on the next step. Listened. The tips from that night were unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra for piano lessons she'd been postponing. As she locked up and walked home, the crisp air filling her lungs, Deborah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Certainty. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just a dreamer. She was an artist. And nothing, not mocking words, not financial struggles, not fear, could take that away from her. But as she walked, her thoughts weren't on the night's conflict. They were on the future, where her dreams finally felt closer than ever. Deborah sat on the worn bench in her small apartment, her fingers gliding over the keys of her old upright piano. The sound wasn't as crisp or rich as the grand piano at La Fontaine, but it didn't matter. The music came from her heart, just as it always had that night. Something shifted within her. Not just a moment of triumph, but a realization that her talent wasn't something she needed to hide or justify. It was hers. And it was enough. In the days that followed, the events at the restaurant became something of a local story. Patrons who had witnessed her performance shared the tale, and word began to spread. A few days later, Deborah received a call from a man who had been dining that night. A music producer visiting from Nashville. He wasn't offering fame or fortune, but a chance to record a demo, a step towards something she had only dared to dream of. Deborah agreed, not because she believed it would change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening, one she wasn't afraid to walk through. For years, she had let fear and doubt whisper lies into her mind, telling her she wasn't enough, that her dreams were too big. But now she saw the truth. Resilience and authenticity were her greatest strengths. The incident with Leonard Grayson wasn't just a humiliating spectacle turned victory. It was a reminder of the power of integrity. Leonard, for all his wealth and bravado, had nothing that could diminish her. He represented every voice of doubt she had ever faced, and she silenced him with nothing but the purity of her craft. To anyone watching her story, Deborah's message was clear. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of Leonard Grayson, people who project their insecurities onto others to feel powerful. But true power comes from staying rooted in who you are and letting your passions speak louder than their ridicule. As she closed the piano lid and rested her hands on the faded wood, Deborah smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like it had truly begun. What about you? What dream have you been holding back on because of fear or doubt? Don't wait for someone like Leonard to test you.
Take your step forward now. If Deborah's story inspired you, subscribe for more stories of resilience and triumph. Your story could be next.